you so much for that gracious introduction. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Madam First Lady, and distinguished guests, thank you so much for inviting me here to this wonderful country where I have had wonderful hospitality and frankly learned a huge amount about the progress that's being made here. And I think you should invite people like me down here often because I can't wait to go home and tell everyone about the computer learning centers and so many of the exciting things that are going on here. And I am actually available on a regular basis to come down here to this lovely country. And John, thank you so much for putting this together. I'm going to try to put to lie the idea that the strategists are the ones who talk the longest and see if I can come in under my colleague Ben, who has so much to discuss. But I could actually talk for at least a couple of weeks about this campaign and promise you I won't. Okay. It is in many ways the first American campaign of the 21st century, one in which the candidate who was born at the tail end of what we call in our country the baby boomer generation, really related to young people, but in addition put together a very different kind of campaign than the kind of campaign that you have seen in the United States over the past 20 to 30 years. That now looking back now, a week from inauguration as we are, many would argue that Barack Obama's victory in 2008 was inevitable, that it was always going to happen. And they would say the reasons are clear, that the unpopularity of President Bush made it nearly impossible for a Republican, even a Republican like John McCain, to be elected in 2008. That's the any Democrat would have won kind of school of thought. There are also those who say that given the state of the economy in the United States, that any candidate who represented a break from the policies of the past would have won, regardless of who they were or what they represented, that the nation was ready for radical change. And there are also those who argue that the demographics of the United States are changing so dramatically, that it's a friendly electorate now, both for a Democrat, but also for a person of color. And while there is some element of truth in all of those, I can only tell you that 2 years ago, had we been meeting here, you would not have heard anyone saying Barack Hussein Obama will be the next president of the United States. And I think if you were reading the New York Times or the Washington Post or looking at CNN or doing anything else, you would not have heard people saying, oh yes, that first-term senator from Illinois whose name is Barack Obama, who happens to be an African-American male, he's a shoo-in for the presidency next time. So in retrospect, it looks much easier than it felt at the time, is all I have to say. There were many people in our country, the majority of the political pundits, the press, and certainly our opponents, who felt that Obama was unelectable, that the United States was not ready to elect an African American, that he did not have the experience, that he would be viewed as too risky by key parts of our electorate, and that voters who had been in 2004 ultimately very concerned about national security issues would not give him the presidency. So as usual in the United States, the conventional political wisdom is a wonderful thing to have because you listen to it and then you do the opposite. Okay? And it was very wrong, and it was wrong because Obama is an exceptional candidate, exceptional in terms of the times, exceptional in terms of who he is, and also exceptional in that he saw a very different way to run a campaign from the way that we had previously done campaigns. And he had the courage, some would say the audacity, to go and put a campaign together that was quite different and that fundamentally refused to accept the idea that there were things you could not do in American politics. So I'm going to focus primarily on one of the two things that were most important about this campaign: the message, the consistency of the message, and the control of the message, how we did it. Then I'm going to briefly talk about the importance of politics from the ground up in this campaign, as opposed to politics from the top down, which is where Ben comes into the story with his 13 million people on the internet and all of the extraordinary things that this campaign did with technology. So I think that anyone who is familiar with then Senator Obama's 2004 Democratic Convention speech knows that he made a speech that talked about the importance of change and how we needed to change the political culture in the United States of America, that there were not red states and there were not blue states, that we were the United States, that we had to take the best ideas from both the Democrats and the Republicans, and that no one party had cornered the market on all the good ideas, that if we were going to confront the enormous challenges facing us, we had to pull together. That was the speech in August of 2004 that made him extremely well known, that gave him the opportunity to become a candidate 2 years later. And it was the same message that he used when he was running for president. In fact, one of the most striking things about the campaign is that for 4 years, he said very consistently the same thing about this country. Now, many people often say, well, what does change mean? What is the change that you're going to bring? And in our campaign, we always had what we called the 3 pillars of what change meant for us. The first pillar was that change in American politics meant telling people what they needed to hear, not just what they wanted to hear. So that, the years of politicians taking polls, putting their finger to the wind, and then going out and only saying what they thought the American people wanted to hear them say was not how Obama was going to run the campaign, that he was going to be honest about what he saw as the problems facing the country, but also the opportunities. The second pillar, an important one, was to change the culture of Washington, to move past the poisonous partisan atmosphere between Democrats and Republicans that had led to gridlock, that had led to the United States not tackling some of the huge issues we have in terms of health care, in terms of our economy, in terms of resolution to the war in Iraq, that all of those things had kept us in gridlock. Energy policy, not everyone had talked about it, nothing had happened, and he said we're going to end that culture. We're going to do that. And finally, most importantly, to put the people back in charge, to make the government work for the people again, not the special interests. So to reform the way Washington worked. Well, as you might guess, everyone was like, oh yes, we hear this all the time. But these were the 3 pillars of the campaign. They are what we talked about. They were what the change meant. Now, the end product of those was going to be a better economy, health care for all Americans, an energy policy that will lead America to energy independence in 10 years or 15 years, depending how much we need to push it back thanks to the economy. And above all, hope that once again America could feel optimistic about the future, that we could have hope, and that we could have a politics based on hope and not fear, which is what we had been doing in our country. So the central piece of that message, as I said, was what he did in 2004 when he announced for the presidency in Springfield, Illinois, in February of 2007, in front of 20,000 people in 18-degree weather. That was the message. When he accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency in August of 2008, that was the message. And when he made his victory speech in November 4th, 2008, in Grant Park in Chicago, that was his message. It was consistent. And he didn't change it depending on which audience he was talking to, and he didn't change it depending on which region of the country he was in, and he didn't change it regardless of what his opponents were saying. This was an extraordinary advantage to us in this. The other things that we did in this campaign, though, was in addition to having the consistency of the message, we also had an absolute commitment from our candidate on down to running the campaign differently. And that meant not only building the Obama community, which Ben will talk more about in a minute, but it also meant that the previous 20 years of American politics, which had been, some called it the politics of personal destruction. Some talked about slash and burn. There was a certain style of politics that we had, which was a take no prisoners. If you disagree with your opponent, you don't just disagree on an issue, but you have to go personally attack them. That he would not allow us to run a campaign that way. He did not want to win that way. He thought it was what was wrong with the country. He thought it would make it more difficult for him to govern. And most importantly, he thought it's what divided people and what had kept us from being able to make progress. So we had the challenge of putting together a campaign with new rules. So we did. We had the same kind of rapid response operation that previous campaigns had had. But whereas previous campaigns felt that rapid response meant if somebody punches you in the jaw, you punch them back in the nose, we would say that punch in the jaw just illustrates exactly what's wrong with politics. And we would use the negative tactics of our opponents as an illustration of how they were part of the past, part of the old politics that hadn't served the American people. So we actually, as opposed to responding in kind, we used their tactics to show why it meant they were the wrong campaign and the wrong candidate. And people thought they're not tough enough. But it worked because the American people were ready for this approach. We stayed on the offensive. We did have a saying that if we weren't on the offensive, if we weren't out there defining the choice, then the choice was going to be defined for us and we would be on the defensive. Being on the offensive didn't mean attacking every day. It meant going out there every day and making the case of why we needed change, why Barack Obama was the right person to bring about change. And we did it. We used to say there are a million reasons why this country needs change, and we only have 365 days in a year to talk about them. But we did that every day. We talked about change and why our opponents couldn't bring about change. We made experience, which was a prime argument of our opponents, we made that a negative trait. Obviously, Senator Obama had the least amount of experience in terms of Washington experience of any candidate running for president in 2008 and any recent candidate. In 2004, he had been a state senator from Illinois. So, we couldn't win the argument about experience in a traditional sense. So we did two things. One is we used our opponent's Washington experience as a problem and said they're good people, but they've been in Washington for too long. They can't change Washington because they are part of Washington. So it was one of the tenets of our campaign that we weren't going to try to argue that his 2 or 3 years in the Senate made him as experienced as anyone else. We were going to say, you want somebody who's been in Washington for 25 years? Got plenty of people running who've been in Washington for a long time, and they all know how Washington works, and they're all part of Washington. And if you think that's great, you go vote for them. On the other hand, if you think maybe Washington needs to change, there's only one candidate who can bring about that change. So we didn't let them use experience as a negative on us. We used experience as a problem of their candidacies. And then the final thing that we did was we felt very strongly that our primary and our general election opponents were going to attack Senator Obama on personal grounds. Because in the primary, we did not have a policy disagreement with any of our opponents. The Democratic Party was pretty united. We all thought the war in Iraq should end. We all want health care. We all felt the economy needed work. We all felt that our schools need to be improved. There was no great disagreement about issues. So we did feel that at the end of the day, the campaigns that were run against Senator Obama in both the primary and the general elections would be ones that sought to personally disqualify him as too inexperienced, as too risky, as someone who had kind of scary friends, whether it was his pastor or whether it was somebody he'd served on some foundation boards with, that they would seek to personally disqualify him. And that was indeed the case. That was the argument against him from both our primary opponent and from Senator McCain in the general election. And so we felt strongly that at the end of the day, Barack Obama was the best answer to the too risky argument, and that communicating directly with people, whether it was through the press in live television or whether it was communication we did ourselves with our supporters and on the internet, was the best antidote. That rather than speak through the filter of interpretation, that we would communicate directly with people, because when they heard Barack Obama and when they saw Barack Obama, he didn't sound scary. He didn't sound risky. He sounded like a president. And as we looked at both the primary and the general election, we saw that there were moments where he would have that opportunity to speak directly, and that those would be important moments, and that those were moments we would build the campaign around: the debates, the acceptance speeches, the foreign trip, the trip he did to Europe, moments when he could speak directly to the American people. And those were critical moments and ones that we took advantage of, because the best answer to the argument that you couldn't trust him was to listen to Barack Obama. Now, the reason I feel strongly this was the first 21st century presidential campaign in the United States is that presidential campaigns in the United States are traditionally very top-down events. They, feature people talking at voters. Our campaign, which had as its candidate someone who began their career in Chicago as a community organizer, working with steel workers who had lost their jobs, working through a Catholic charities group. He believed that politics was about the ground up, and that you needed to go organize people, and that people would change Washington, that Washington wasn't going to change itself, and that the change was going to come not from one person, not from just Barack Obama, but from millions of people across the country getting together to force change on our political system and on our nation. So a fundamental tenet of the campaign from the beginning of the campaign was that this was a campaign that was going to be about people and was not just about the candidate, and was going to put the control and listen to people and be a conversation with the American people. So we set out to do that. And Ben will talk about how the campaign did that using technology. But I will talk a little about the things, before I turn it over to Ben, just very briefly, talk about what people thought when we said we were going to do that. There were many things that conventional wisdom thought about our campaign that were not true, and we've gone through a few. But conventional wisdom said that you couldn't raise the money to be competitive against Senator Hillary Clinton in the primaries because of the enormous popularity of former President Bill Clinton and the fundraising networks they had. Conventional wisdom said that we couldn't raise the money to be out of the general election funding. Conventional wisdom said that young people in the United States wouldn't vote, that every 4 years people talked about young people voting, but they wouldn't vote this time. Conventional wisdom said that the superdelegates, the party elected officials, would all be for Senator Clinton. Conventional wisdom said that if there are rumors about your candidate out there, you should ignore those rumors, pretend they don't exist. Above all, you should never talk about them, because more people will hear the rumors. Conventional wisdom said you can't move your political convention outside of a hall and into a football stadium. And conventional wisdom, above all, said that obviously a black man couldn't win the presidency in the United States in 2008. Step by step, person by person, we set out to organize the United States the way you would organize, as I say, a school board race. And I apologize, I don't know what the equivalent is here. But a very small race in a very big country, the same way, person by person, knocking on doors, telephoning in communities. And we had a large community at the end of this campaign. We had a community of 13 million people who had registered at some point on our internet sites. And then we had people in communities in some of the most old-fashioned campaigning you're ever going to see. You had people knocking on doors. You had people organizing out of churches. You had people carpooling to go to states. You had people basically giving up their time every night and every weekend to go and talk about Barack Obama in any way they could. Now, this campaign was based on the idea that when someone tells you you can't do something, you say, well, why not? And I know that that's an attitude, Mr. President, that you often have as well. So that instead of saying, when people say, no, you can't, you say, well, yes, we can. When we all work together, yes, we can. We could not have done it, though, if we had been a campaign that was just about a candidate and a lot of money on television, and at the end of the day, hoping people would knock on doors. That if it hadn't been an organic campaign that invited people to participate, that was a conversation with people, it would not have been possible. And when Barack Obama would say, yes, we can, he wasn't saying, yes, I can, because he could not have done it by himself, and we could not have done this. When he was attacked, we were able to go out and communicate directly with people. And they knew, we put up a website called Fight the Smears to combat rumors. That was, because we wanted people, if they heard a rumor, to know that they could come directly to us and we'd be straight with them. We told people the important announcements of our campaign before we told the press corps, whether it was the vice president or the fact that we were going to pull out of the public financing. We told our supporters first because that relationship was so important. He is somebody who began his career as a community organizer, and his belief that Washington wouldn't change unless the people changed Washington fueled the entire campaign. So in the United States, campaigns which had traditionally been like a television show for most people, that they watched every 4 years, but they never participated in. We can't go back to that. There's no candidate looking at the next campaign who will think that that is a model that works, because the true strength of the Obama campaign was that it actually turned the campaign back over to the people of the United States. And there's no turning back now. Nobody can win without that. And as we look ahead to governing, keeping those people engaged, keeping all those folks engaged and letting them have a say in their government, and having the government have that communication with them is a challenge, but also an extraordinarily exciting opportunity. So Ben, you want to talk about how you did it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Anita, and thanks, Eduardo, for the wonderful introduction, Mr. President, for having us here, all the distinguished guests. Thank you for giving up your evening and time to listen to us. I am going to talk a little bit about and John as well. Thank you for organizing everything and inviting us. Being the technologist, I couldn't have come without some slides because otherwise, as I said, I would only talk for 2 minutes and then be done. And so I have a few slides, and I apologize, my language skills were not good enough to do slides simultaneously in English and Spanish, but they're mostly pictures, so I think I think they translate quite well. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the details about how one builds, in this case, a fundamental new type a presidential campaign, a new type of organization, and then hope to take it one more step. So whether you work directly for the government here, or for the foundation, or for a nonprofit, or even for a corporation, some of the ideas and things that have been learned through the campaign, you can take to learn how to have a fundamentally new type of relationship with whatever people you have a relationship with. So, as Anita said, President-elect built a movement of incredible size. He brought more people into the campaign and asked them to do more than any other candidate has ever done when running for office. And the other piece is that he trusted them more and asked them to do things on behalf of him in a way that no candidate in the United States has ever done that before. But it's easy to kind of misunderstand the size of this. So just as a starting point, I want to talk through some examples of the size. Online video. There were more than 1,800 videos created by the campaign, viewed more than 50 million times by people, who watched more than 14 million hours of video produced by the campaign. It's a phenomenal amount of time you could never purchase on television because you could never afford that. It's just a huge number. Voter contacts. We talked as a campaign to more than 68 million voters. 68 million contacts. Those are door knocks. Those are phone calls. Those are individual contacts that were made and reported back to the campaign. As overall, and taking into account all of the campaigns going on, there were more than 230 million voter contacts made. There's only 180 million voters in the United States. You can see what a phenomenal number that is. And then finally, of course, the one everyone loves to talk about, the money raised. More than 770 million raised, with more than half of it online. Over 500 million raised online. So, clearly we're talking about a very big thing. And so to explain it a little bit, I want to take the traditional frame that one talks about. This is no rocket science. Money, message, and mobilization. But talk about how those applied in a technology manner, online, in a grassroots way, and what we did that was a little bit different. So let's talk about the money again. I'm going to delve into this one because it's one that's often mentioned in the paper. Clearly, this president-elect raised a phenomenal amount of money. It's almost incomprehensible. But I'm trying to talk a little bit here about how that happened. So I think the first step and the first most important thing, and this is something that applies anywhere, is to lower the barrier to entry to the campaign. This is a screenshot that I took at one point during the campaign. And as you can see, there's about 10 different ways that you can get involved in the campaign. You could volunteer, you could donate, you can make calls, knock on doors. But the idea was that if you get people through the door, you can even see it on the top upper corner of the screen, a place to just put in your email address and zip code where you lived, bring you into that door with the lowest possible barrier to entry. And the first dollar asked for the campaign would be $5. Can you spare $5 to help change the way this country is going? And it's a very easy way to get people in. And with that, we were able to get more than 3.2 million individual donors to the campaign. 3.2 million Americans that gave $5 or many more dollars. The average donation was under $100. And so it's through reaching out to more people than ever that you're able to do these sorts of things. Second important thing about fundraising that I think it's interesting to talk about is the importance of email. Many people misunderstand this. This is one of the many fundraising emails that went out there. But the idea is that when you're communicating people with email, it's a very personal interaction. People get emails from their friends. They get emails from their husbands and wives, their children, their families. And they also receive emails from campaigns and organizations. And you've got to make the ones that are from organizations more like the ones from their children or from their husband or wife. That's when you really interact with someone. But you're going to always reach more people via email than you do with any website or any other piece of technology. As Anita said, there were more than 13 million Americans that you could reach through email in the campaign. So any message you send out gets sent to 13 million people in 2 hours. That's a phenomenal megaphone you have to talk to people in a way and to communicate with them at scales that we've never done before. Finally, staying on the money theme, asking people to raise money themselves for the campaigns. A couple tricks that are ideas. This is empowering individuals to raise money for the campaign in their name. So you could set up your own fundraising page and ask people, tell them why you donated, why the race was important to you, and then ask your friends and family to do it themselves. And finally, my favorite is a tool called Grassroots Match, and many of the early money in the campaign came through from this tool. So this takes a very traditional idea of fundraising, where I'm sure many of you have seen these before. You get a fundraising appeal, whether it's from a nonprofit or maybe from a university you went to or something like that, that said, we have a very wealthy donor who has pledged $3 million to this campaign. Every donation you give, that wealthy donor will give $3. So we're going to triple your impact on every donation. Well, this is very common. It comes in the mail, direct mail techniques in the United States all the time. And what we said is, I think that people don't believe this. It sounds very fake. It sounds contrived. And so instead, let's change that. And let's take the existing donors we have there and match them up with new donors. So let's send an email to every person who's ever donated to the campaign before and say, will you pledge another $10 to the campaign if we can find a new donor out there that's willing to give $10 as well? And so there would be a list of people who'd given before. It says, yes, I will take that pledge. And so then you end up with 10,000 people who've pledged to give another $10. You then talk to the rest of the people out there who've never given before and say, we have 10,000 people out there willing to give $10 if you give $10 right now. And when they do, they exchange an email. And so a voter or a donor in Indiana might be paired with a donor in Colorado. And suddenly they've exchanged an email. They each type out an email before they even know who they're matched with. It goes forward, and they're talking about why they're dedicated to the campaign, why they're committed enough to give their time and give their money. And suddenly this becomes very real for people. And what you see is they get matched with someone, and then they go back and they go and do it 4 more times. Because getting matched with someone real in another state that they had never met before, it's like a pen pal, right? It's really, it's breaking down barriers and making people feel like it really is real. So let's talk about message. Anita was talking about this before. Using facts to fight rumors and using facts online. This was the website she was in fact referring to. I'm sure you heard of many of the horrible rumors that went around, which were all false about the campaign, but addressing them directly online with facts, that are true. And then aggressively advertising that, so that when someone searched for, one of the examples was that President-elect was a Muslim, and buying those search terms so that if someone heard that from their friend at work and went to their computer and typed it in, actually it would point a link to this site, and then you would get the exact information and fight it that way. Also with the prevalence of now email clients like Gmail or other things online, when even they would receive an email about it, and it was someone forwarding on an email that was not true, the link would appear right next to it, so that you could fight the truth with the truth in your hand right at the point where they got it. We talked a little bit about this earlier. The messaging of YouTube and online video is just a whole new method of communications that didn't really exist before. Old campaigns, you would talk about TV and direct mail and media, the press, but being able to communicate directly with voters in huge numbers via video. His historic speech on race, where it was a 45-minute, I believe, speech that was watched in its entirety tens of thousands of times online.
It's still one of the most viewed.
Yeah, exactly. It's a phenomenal speech, but the fact that people can access that at any point when they're at work, at home, in their own comfort, just allows you to reach people that you would have never reached beforehand. And then finally, mobilization. My Barack Obama, one of the tools there, allows people to organize in huge numbers. It was a site, a place where people could go and identify friends and sign up to join groups like Latinos for Obama, where they could blog or they could talk about things and whatever they wanted to do. But there were more than 20,000 of these groups nationwide. 20,000 groups of people who would get together and talk and mobilize and perform actions to help the campaign. There were more than 200,000 events planned, not online events, where people used online technologies to meet in a room with fellow supporters and knock on doors or communicate or talk or otherwise or rally, distribute campaign literature. Over 100,000 blog posts and bloggers that wrote on the site. So this allowed individuals to mobilize and engage in ways that were never possible. This is another example of the page. And so I want to talk about one of those that I find particularly interesting, which is a tool. Traditionally in campaigns, people would they would go to the campaign office and volunteer, and they would get a list of voters and then go out and talk door to door. Well, what we said was, let's change that a little bit, and instead, let's allow individuals to download from their computers in their home their 25 closest neighbors, and let's let them talk to them. So a volunteer would give us their home address, wherever that was, and we would send back to them the targeted voters in their area. The 25 closest people. And you not only get those voters, but then we'd send you their address. This was one of these lists, an address, a point on the map so that you could find them. And then we'd ask these people. We'd train them, give them a video online, and then ask them to go out and talk to voters. And this allowed personal contact to happen at a scale that it's never happened before. All the data comes back. All the data goes back into a national database, which is one of the kind of not as flashy sides, but being able to store every voter in the country and track that data and talk to, this is something that works. This isn't just for elections. This is for anything. Tracking your relationship with a person obviously is a key. But it allows you to organize in a way that you just never, and talk to voters in states that, where there are activists, but never would have talked before. It allows you to have things like this, where the number of contacts goes up phenomenally. And this is kind of the dream when you're starting anything. This is they call a hockey stick in the United States, that it's shaped directly, and going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So, transitioning off of the campaign and what are some of the lessons learned, I think it's really, I want to talk for a few minutes about this and say, citizens, whether you're a company, a nonprofit, or an organization, or government, are going to start expecting to interact with you differently. They expect a personal interaction. They expect an authentic interaction. And so my charge to you as a whole would be that industries are adapting, and you should try and form a new way to interact with individuals. So I think you have really two options for this. You have one option, which is to let it happen organically. And this is what happens in many, many cases right now, where people will organize, whether you're providing them help or not, and they'll build their own tools and technologies and get together with their friends, and if they care about the environment, they'll sit there and they'll figure out a recycling program for their neighborhood. So that's one option. The other option is to provide a focal point to be able to harness those people and to bring them together in a manner that you can both ask them to do things for you, but can also challenge them to do more themselves. I'm going to talk about really quickly a local example. I live in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm in the center of the United States there. In a city, it's 500,000 people, so not a very big town. And earlier this year, the mayor and one of the developers of this town came to the city with a plan to demolish a city block with buildings that were 200 years old, which is pretty old for the United States, and build this building, which it would be the tallest building in town. It would not, and it would be a hotel for the very, very rich. So needless to say, people were not happy about this. They were demolishing bars, they were demolishing historic buildings, things that had been there for a long time, businesses, mother and family businesses, in order for this, and had done it without consulting the city at all. And 20 years ago, 10 years ago, what would have happened? There would have been a few people organizing, a few people unhappy. We would have had a city council meeting of the councilors for that city, and 3 people would have shown up and complained, and then it would have moved on. Not anymore. Within 24 hours, a Facebook group. Facebook is an online organizing tool. It's a social network, and I'm sure many of you are on it. was formed with 1,600 members in the first 24 hours. They had more than 20 events in the next 2 weeks. They raised tens of thousands of dollars, and every time there was a meeting of the officials, they packed the halls. So much so they had to have extra rooms where they would broadcast the meetings through video. This is an example where, because there was no focal point for them to go to, they formed their own and they self-organized. And so this is what's going to happen. People are going to start to self-organize and do things themselves no matter what. So, there are all these new tools, whether they're Facebook or Twitter, that are possible examples for this. But, I think that you need to, people go, they can organize. But my charge to you is that, you can build your own, whether it's something like, my Barack Obama, or here's another example of one, of these focal points, these places where you can bring citizens together to do new things. This is a kind of mundane one in the United Kingdom. What do people complain about locally? Potholes, right? And the problems in the road is a headache for local officials, particularly in the United States, because people don't have much else to complain about, I think. And so, this is a place where people go and report problems with their roads. And, it sounds really silly and mundane, but, they've reported 300 in the last week, and they fixed 500 in the last month, but it allows people to go report problem, and then the important problems bubble up to the top. And so you're giving people a place to do it rather than what they're just talking about it at home or to their neighbors and able to address it. Another example I like to talk about is the mayor of New York City, Mike Bloomberg, had a challenge to plant 1 million trees in New York City over some period of time. I think it was 10 years. Of course, the city couldn't afford to buy 1 million trees and plant them, and didn't really have a place to plant 1 million trees. But what they did instead was, through this organization, set up a place where I, as a citizen, could say, I've planted a tree, and I'm going to report it. Or I want to plant a tree on my street, or I know a good place for it. And suddenly you have individuals out there planting trees, achieving the goal that the city could never have achieved by itself, because you empowered citizens to take action by themselves. And in this case, they've planted 97,000 trees that would never have been planted in New York City otherwise, just because they gave them a charge, gave them a place to do it, and made them accountable. So, that's my big thesis, is that you really do need to give citizens the tools they need to solve their own problems, and then you can achieve all sorts of things, whether it's electing a president or the environment, that you never would have been able to have the manpower or resources to solve on your own. So the big advantage of that, I think, is that once you give them that place, you bring these people together, what do you do with them? How do you transition those people that you've collected, whether you're fixing potholes or planting trees, and get them to do what you want them to do? I think these are the kind of the Bible in many ways of new campaigns and online organizing. So we're going to talk about each of these just briefly. Regular. I think that when you're interacting with citizens, whether they're being engaged, when they're online or anything, it's much like a relationship. You don't ask them out on a date and then on the next day propose marriage. You have to bring them through the stages and develop this relationship to them. Well, how do you do that? I think it's by having regular communications. You start off talking to them. Start at ask them to do small things for you. And then by having those regular interactions with people, no matter what, you move to a place where you can finally get engaged. Authentic. The number of people who many years ago would just send press releases to their list was unbelievable. There's still many organizations. Individuals, can't read press releases. It's a big no-no. Members of the media here, I apologize, but most people don't read press releases. They don't really, it's not designed for people. So talk to them in a way that's real. Make it more like they're, reading a letter from their friends instead of from an organization. So authenticity is another key. Transparency. This is my favorite example of transparency. This is Dave Plouffe, the campaign manager for the Obama campaign, would send these videos out to people sitting in his office where he would talk to them about the current strategy and what they're really doing in the campaign. There'd be 10 minutes. They'd be informal. He would talk about specifics. He would say, we're going to spend this many dollars in Florida, and we need you to raise money. You know, it wasn't breaking news in a way. You know, this was not new things that weren't already announced, but it was an individual connection between the campaign and the voter, bringing them in, trusting them with information that no campaign has ever trusted anyone with before. So that transparency, being real, is one of the other big pillars. Lower the barrier to entry. I put this here because even though we talked about it earlier, it's a reminder. Make it easy for people to get engaged. And what happens when you do that is you get numbers, graphs like this. You would think the number of people engaged online would be very heavily rated towards the younger side. But really the most popular demographic for these active users was the people 53 to 57. It's a phenomenal concept that you're able to engage with people, not just the youth, but all people through technology. And finally, raise your expectations. You know, there's some pyramid of engagement that you have, starting at the bottom and going at the top. But you never know what people are willing to do for you until you ask. And people, when you tap into passion, will do phenomenal things for you, things you never thought possible. And so it's really important to raise those expectations so that you move people from just, you know, very base level of communications all the way up to be your most engaged and dynamic supporters. And then finally, the last key thing, and this is something Anita alluded to earlier, was you really need to start measuring everything. So no longer are we in a place where you have to guess. Through technology, through online video, you can see which ads are the most effective before you ever go forward with them. You can, through testing of emails, you can tell if people, you know, like message A more or message B more. Doesn't matter what you're messaging about, you can still test what that is. So that the fact that technology allows you to measure things you could never measure before is just a huge difference. So with that, I really want to leave you with one final thought, and I figured this picture was a good example of it. You know, technology, I'm not here to say technology is going to solve all of your problems. I think the key thing I want you to take away is that what you can really do is use it to amplify excitement that's already there, passion that's already there, enthusiasm, whether it's there for a candidate and you're running for office, whether it's there for a cause, you care about poverty, whether it's there about a product, if you're trying to sell a cellular phone. You know, this technology, you know, people may not even know they have that enthusiasm. You may be tapping into unknown enthusiasm, but the technology can be used, you know, and so that gives you the appearance of creating it, but really, technology, online engagement, grassroots activism doesn't create enthusiasm where there isn't any before, and it can't be used to hide something that you're trying to hide from a lot of people. Really, what you want to use is technology to amplify things. So that in some ways, it's the second step. So first, you have to create that value or enthusiasm for whatever it is that you're passionate about. And then you can use technology and grassroots activism to make it bigger than you ever really thought was possible. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Anita y Ben, por dos presentaciones verdaderamente interesantes, de las cuales yo en particular he aprendido mucho y sé que la audiencia también. Ahora, precisamente en esta lógica de involucrar a los participantes, a los que están acá como parte de la audiencia, me gustaría abrir ahora el foro para preguntas de la audiencia. Y en particular quisiera que pensemos un poco en un mensaje que transmitió Ben al final, es decir, cómo podemos aprender de esta muy interesante forma de hacer política nueva, usando tecnología nueva en la región, en América Latina. Quisiera abrir el foro entonces para preguntas de la audiencia. Me gustaría que se identificaran dándome su nombre y haciendo preguntas concisas y claras, y dirigidas a las personas en particular. ¿Preguntas?
Luis Mejía, programa Hoy Mismo. Si a partir de esta experiencia con la tecnología, si esto marca ya un precedente para que futuras campañas si ya el mundo electoral tendría que verse a partir de este uso de la tecnología.
I think that there is no way that we could possibly ever go back from this. You know, this is a precipice that we have crossed that no candidate will ever. Citizens are not going to, in the United States in particular, are never going to go back to a place where your only interaction with a candidate was through fundraisers and through, you know, the paper and things like that. They expect a more authentic interaction now. They've been exposed to an incredibly authentic interaction, and they can smell, you know, you think oftentimes the citizens are those other people, right? But it's not, right? It's all of you, it's all of us. And they're just as smart as we are, and they know and can smell out something that's fake just as fast as we can. And so you're never going to be able to go back to a situation where you're not being true and authentic and engaging with people where they live and online and through grassroots activism.
Anita, would you?
Yes, I would add to that people also increasingly are getting the bulk of their political information from the internet. In the United States, they're not getting it from newspapers, and they're getting it less from television. And they're going out and looking for their own information. They're looking for people who control them, so that to some extent the power structures that have controlled our campaigns, the political parties, the press, are being supplanted by people taking into their own hands the traditional roles. They're going to get information about candidates, they're looking for issue positions, and the ability to go find like-minded people to organize together to promote a cause or a candidate. So this really is a transformation that is an ongoing transformation in terms of our politics in the United States, where the roles of all the players are changing.
Te comentaba hoy, Anita, diciendo que no había más, o por lo menos se trataba de comunicar sin filtros. Yo creo que uno de los placeres más importantes que tuvo esta campaña es no depender solamente de traditional media. ¿Qué porcentaje en la campaña de Obama le asignaron a la comunicación through traditional media y la otra parte through the new media o the electronic media?
Thank you for an excellent question. Our new media section of the campaign was, I think, the largest department, but understand it was, in addition to allowing us to communicate directly with our supporters, it was also fundraising. Our new media section was in charge of recording all our videos. They traveled with the candidate and with the vice presidential nominee once and recorded everything, did the photos, updated the website. We had, for the press department, working with the traditional press, we had people assigned to us who, for instance, developed our Fight the Smears website, which we put in place for the general election after having one too many emails that the candidate and his wife said, isn't there something more effective we can do than just read these things? And the answer was yes, we're going to try something different. We had, obviously, a large department to deal with the traditional media in the United States, and given both the national and the international interest in this election, we had a gigantic press corps and a huge number of requests. But the reality is that whether it was a David Plouffe video or an Obama speech, that a huge part of our press strategy was focused on making the media cover what Obama was actually saying, as opposed to, why the campaign was saying it, what the tactic was. That we had a huge premium both on message discipline, on people in the campaign not leaking to reporters, on people in the campaign not discussing our strategy, and also on making the press cover what we were saying. So we, one of the reasons we did so many of the David Plouffe videos was not just for our supporters, but also because it was a way for us to get our message out without having to actually talk to reporters. We just put that out there and make them write what Plouffe had said, as opposed to Plouffe doing an interview with a reporter. So it was very much, we controlled it as opposed to the press controlled it. And it did not always make us popular with the press. But we increasingly, by the general election, very rarely did we communicate through the press anything that we didn't absolutely control. Senator Obama himself did a lot of local television. We went to as much live television as possible, so it couldn't be edited. When it came to him, it was live, so that he could speak in longer than a 12-second sound bite, so that what the voters heard, we determined, as opposed to some editor in a TV station. But we went to alternative media a great deal. And one of the things that I probably should have mentioned in mine was that one of the reasons that the website worked so well was we used opportunities in the traditional media to drive people online, to basically say that's where you can get more information, that's where you can get the most updated information. And that we used speeches, we used appearances, and we used press to basically drive people to our website, which increased our traffic. When he was on TV, the traffic would go up anyway. But that they have to work together. It all has to work together.